In the Torah, we find the three holidays that are referred to as festivals. The first of the festivals is the holiday of Pesach. That's the holiday of redemption. The second festival is the festival of Shavuos. This is when we became the chosen people, as we refer to it as Zman Matan Torasenu. It's a time of the giving of our Torah. And the closing festival of the year, which is in the new year, is Sukkot. The holiday of Sukkot. For 7 days, two things, the two very specific mitzvahs, commandments given. We must sit in the Sukkah, which we can discuss in a moment, for 7 days, meaning if we choose to eat a bread meal, which is something which is substantial, you must eat it in the Sukkah. In addition to the Sukkah, there's a mitzvah, which is the mitzvah of taking the 4 species of the Luluv. That's the esrog, the palm branch, the myrtle, and the willow. These are the 4 species. And we take the 4 species and we wave them. Waving means we wave it in all 4 directions and we lift it up and down. That's waving. 4 directions and towards vertically up and down. That's the mitzvah of the Luluv. The reason why we refer to it as Luluv is because since it's the largest of the species, we refer to it as the mitzvah of Luluv. Even the text of the bracha, of the blessings we say, when we take the 4 species, is al natilas Luluv, even though the 3 other species, besides the Luluv, of course, it's the most obvious and the largest of the 4. Therefore, when men of the High Assembly legislated the blessing is al natilas Luluv. We've been commanded to be sanctified with the taking of the Luluv. So we have 2 mitzvahs which interplay. All male Jews must sit in the sukkah. Women have no obligation in the sukkah, as we discussed in the past. Just as the Shema, any mitzvah which is determined by time, a woman has no obligation. So sukkah is only 7 days a year. Therefore, a woman is exempt. She's permitted to sit in the sukkah. The 4 species that we have to take, the mitzvah on each individual is on the first day of Sukkot. As it says, "L'kachtem l'chem b'yom harishon, pre-eitz hador." You must take it the first day of the holiday of Sukkot, pre-eitz hador, this fruit that is naturally beautiful. Normally, when we do something in the most elaborate way, that is usually an enhancement of the mitzvah. Even if you don't do it in the most elaborate way, as long as you meet certain basic criteria, you fulfill the mitzvah. In regard to what we call the citron, the esrog, unless it's naturally a beautiful fruit, let's say it's blemished, it's spotted, one does not fulfill his obligation, because the Torah refers to as a fruit that's innately attractive, beautiful. So if it's lacking that characteristic, it doesn't meet the grade whatsoever, it's not valid. That's specifically the esrog. Other mitzvos, you buy a quality talus. The garment is quality. The strings are quality. Not only are you fulfilling the mitzvah of tzitzis, wearing a 4-cornered garment with fringes on the corners, but you're doing it in an enhanced context. It's referred to as zekelim hanveyu. We said that at the splitting of the sea, the Jewish people, when they saw God's presence, said, "That is God. We will enhance him. We'll extol him." So what's an expression of extolling? To do something in the most elaborate way. For instance, the Chavetz Chaim writes in the Mishnah Berurah that if a person has a menorah, you can fulfill your obligation with a simple tin menorah, Chanukiah. But if you buy one made of silver, although the mitzvah is lighting the lights every day, adding another light, but if the receptacle in which you light it is made of silver, That's an endearment of the mitzvah. It elevates the quality of the mitzvah. But even if one lights it in a simple tin menorah, Chanukah, one fulfills his obligation. In regard to the esrog, the citron, it must be naturally a beautiful fruit. As I said, if it's flawed, blemished, spotted, it's not valid. So we have to discuss why, in regard to the esrog, must it innately be beautiful? Of the mitzvahs, it's only an enhancement of the mitzvah. But even if it's not, the base mitzvah, one fulfills his obligation, which we're going to discuss. So we have an interplay of two mitzvahs. 7 days, the Torah says, we must sit in the sukkah for 7 days. Why? That all your generations should know, that when we were in the desert, we sat in sukkos. Sukkos, the question, sukkah, when we refer to the sukkah, it's the booth. It's that hut, four-cornered hut, which has either bamboo poles on the roof, other type of vegetation that's cut, whether it's ferns or pine needles, whatever it may be, covers the top. That's a sukkah. When we sit in those booths, we're commemorating the sukkos which we spent 40 years in the desert after we left Egypt until we went into the promised land. Now, first, what are those sukkos? We'll discuss that also. Let's get back originally. The Torah, who's the first of the Code of Laws, writes that the holiday of Pesach corresponds to Avram Avinu. That corresponds to Avram. We find that when the angels came to Avram Avinu, what was Sarah baking? Sarah was baking matzos. It was Pesach. Although Avram Avinu was not a Jew, he was a Noahide, nevertheless, he fulfilled the Torah in entirety, including rabbinic fences, even before it was given at Sinai. So it was the 15th of Nisan. So what was Sarah, our matriarch, what was she baking? She was baking matzah. So we find the holiday of Pesach corresponds to Avram Avinu. The holiday of Shavuos corresponds to Yitzchak, and the holiday of Sukkot corresponds to Yaakov. Why does the holiday of Sukkot correspond to Yaakov? Because we find that when Yaakov spent all the years and he had his family, he's coming back with his wealth and his family. The Torah says he built sukkos. He built huts. It was an 18-month trek back from Mesopotamia back to Canaan. So it says he built sukkos. Yaakov built sukkos. Therefore, the holiday, the festival of Sukkos, corresponds to Yaakov Avinu. Okay, we discussed this also. What's the relevance of Sukkos to Yaakov Avinu? The Torah tells us the story that Avram was circumcised at the age of 99. And when he was circumcised, Hashem says to him, your name will no longer be Avram, it is Avraham. A hay was added to his name. Although it says in the stars, and Avram was an expert astrologer, Avram will not have a son. Avram ein lo ben, Avraham yesh lo ben. Abraham has no son, but Abraham will have a son. And that's what Hashem says. It's irrelevant what it says in the stars. You're no longer that same person. Through this circumcision, a metamorphosis took place within you. You're a different dimension of person. That's Avram. The Maral cites a medrash that at the beginning of creation, the Torah writes in Hebrew the word Vihi Boram. Vihi Boram, when God created them, referring to the creation of the world. So the Midrash says the letters Vihi Boram, if you rearrange the letters, it spells Avraham. Vihi Boram is Avram. So the Maral of Prague explains that Avram Avinu, although as a physical human being, he was a continuation of creation from the time of Adam, but in terms of his innate value, his level of representation, what he was and what he represented, that level of representation did not precede his being. When he became Avraham, it was actually ex nihilo. in terms of that dimension of spirituality, did not precede that moment. So Avraham Avinu, Abraham, our patriarch, is the beginning of a new existence. When we left Egypt to become God's chosen people at Sinai, I had mentioned the Shalom writes that we became a new, it was a nation, it was the beginning of a new existence. As the Jewish people were not part of existence. Creation was 7 days. The 70 root nations, the Jewish people are the 71st nation. We supersede the natural order. We're not part of that. When we came into being at the time we left Egypt to become God's chosen people, we became the 71st people, 71. We're not part of the natural order. Therefore, that was the next Nilo. That was the beginning of a new big existence. We find that the month of Nisan, which is the month we celebrate, Pesach, is a month of Chesed. We give, especially, it's an ancient custom, it's called Mos Chitim. We provide the means for the poor to buy wheat for matzah and whatever the provisions they need for Pesach. What's the basis for it? So the Shalom Kodesh writes that just as David Melch writes in Tehillim and Psalms, Olam Chesed Yibaneh, why did God create the world? It was due to his indiscriminate kindness. He had no reason to accept purely so mankind should be a beneficiary of the ultimate good. Identically, just as the impetus for creation was Chesed, when the Jews left Egypt, it's a month of Chesed. We personally weren't worthy. The Jews left Egypt, we were idolaters. In Egypt, we became idolaters. In Egypt, we stopped circumcising ourselves after that original generation passed away. Nevertheless, because of the covenant and the promise to the patriarchs, God took us out of Egypt. But really, we weren't worthy. It was purely Chesed. It was God's indiscriminate kindness. But again, just as the beginning of existence, the impetus for existence was God's indiscriminate kindness, we becoming the Jewish people was the beginning of a new beginning. That's Chesed, Olam Chesed Yibaneh. Therefore, the month of Nisan is a month we do Chesed. We provide for those, the needy who don't have. We don't even know who they are. It doesn't make a difference. That's indiscriminate kindness. We don't owe it to them. Nevertheless, we do it. Avraham Avinu of the patriarchs is referred to as the pillar of loving kindness, indiscriminate kindness. His home had 4 entrances. Every human being was welcome to enter and receive and be a beneficiary of Avram's hospitality. That was Avram. So the holiday, the festival of Pesach, corresponds to Avraham Avinu. Let's talk about Sukkot. Now, the Torah tells us the story that it was the 3rd day of Avram's circumcision, and God had taken the sun out of its sheath. It was the hottest day in existence. Why? Because Avram himself, at that time, he was 99 years old. Man of that age, he had to really convalesce after circumcision. And the 3rd day of circumcision was the most difficult day. Here, Avram is engaged in hospitality 24 hours a day. All of a sudden now, he comes to an abrupt halt because it's a day which the heat is so overly consuming, nobody could go out. And Avram is beside himself. He's sitting at the entrance of his tent, looking in every direction. Where are the wayfarers to host them? And Avram himself is pained to the point where the whole purpose of taking the sun out of its sheath was to give him that respite, to be able to convalesce. And here, denying him that ability, he's more pained and he's suffering to a greater degree than being engaging in hospitality. So what does God do? He sends 3 angels in human form, and they show up, and he sees them at a distance, and he runs towards them, although the wound is still raw. And the Midrash tells us he ran towards them. Due to that exertion, there were 3 droplets of blood which dripped from him. And those droplets represent something very valuable. The reason why we married the Paschal lamb on Pesach was due to those drops of blood, which actually dripped from that wound. That's how he became totally negated to hospitality, to do chesed. The pain, he didn't even sense the pain. He was totally consumed to do this, okay? He runs towards them, he prostrates himself before them, and he offers his hospitality. Lie under the shade of my tree, wash your feet, have a morsel of bread. And this is what he does. So the Midrash and the Talmud tell us, in the merit of every aspect of this hospitality, the Jews were beneficiary hundreds of years later. In the merit of saying, Hishonu tachseitz, rest under the shade of my tree, we merited for 40 years in the desert the clouds of glory, which protected us from the elements, which protected us on many levels. It had a miraculous effect on us. When we traveled, there was never an incline, there was never going up or going down, everything was straight. All the mountains were flattened. There was no such thing as snakes, scorpions. Everything was destroyed by the clouds of glory. They were consumed. Their clothing didn't have to be laundered. The clouds of glory laundered the clothing. The clothing did not wear out. The clothing grew on them. The Midrash says, just as an animal, its hide grows on its body, identically, the clothing the Jews wore in the desert, a child was an infant, as he grew, his clothing miraculously grew on him. One didn't need more than one suit of clothing his whole life during this 40-year period. This was the effect of the clouds of glory. And that was in the merit that Avraham Avinu had said, rest under the shade of my tree, that he offered the angels. When he said, take water and wash your feet, in the merit of that, we merited the wellspring of Miriam. 40 years, the wellspring of Miriam traveled with us, we provided water for millions of people. Miracle. In the merit of Echo Pas Lechem, take a morsel of bread, we merited the manna, which was miracle food, which the Jews ingested it, there was no waste. For 40 years. And whatever came to a person's mind, whatever level of nourishment a person would want, the manna took on that innate value and nourished them on that level. The manna. And that sustained us for 40 years. In the merit of the hospitality of Avraham Avinu, the clouds of glory were due to rest under the shade of my tree. As the shade of my tree protects you, the clouds of glory will protect your children. In the merit of the water, your children will be provided with water. That's the wellspring of Miriam. In the merit of the bread, it's the manna. So I pointed out then, why did God send angels in human form? So the words of the Midrash is because Abram was mitztayer. He was pained. He was pained that he couldn't offer hospitality. So I asked the question, is it because Abram, he was a very wealthy man? As we say in the vernacular, the money was burning a hole in his pocket. He had this reserve of food and it was going to spoil. I mean, what exactly was the pain of Avraham Avinu? So we explained that the Midrash tells us there was no pagan or heretic who entered to Avraham Avinu's tent to be a beneficiary of his hospitality, who entered as that pagan and walked out as a pagan. Every person he engaged with was a convinced monotheist when he left. Now, the world itself is God's world, and everybody gives homage to the deity. Avraham Avinu felt this is the ultimate level of desecration of God's name. God's picking up the tab, so to say, is underwriting the whole enterprise, and everybody's giving thanks to others. So every moment Avram, every person engaged with, he was always successful to convince him that there's a monotheistic God, and everything else is false. So every moment Avram couldn't engage in this dialogue, there was an ongoing desecration of God's name. That was the source of his pain. He couldn't tolerate it. If there are no wayfarers, that means he's not engaged in converting pagans into monotheists. So God, because he was pained to such a degree, what did God do? He brought angels in human form. If the angels would have come in as angels, there wouldn't have been a basis to provide us hospitality. If there wouldn't have been the basis to offer us hospitality, because they came for a specific reason. They had an agency. One was to inform Sarah she was going to have a child. The other one was to what? Tiyel Avram after circumcision. The other was to what? To go destroy Sodom. They came for a purpose. If they were to come in angel form, there's no basis for hospitality. They only came as human beings in human form because Avram was pained that he couldn't provide this service which ultimately facilitates monotheism. So what I said then was, what was the result of that pain? What were the fruits of that pain? The fruits of that pain was he was able to offer the shade of his tree. He was able to offer the water for them to wash their feet. He was able to provide bread. But what was the ultimate value of that? We had the manna in the desert, which sustained us for 40 years. As the Midrash tells us, the manna was more than just physically sustaining us. It spiritualized the Jews. Lonida Torah el ochle amam. We were spiritualized through that food, and therefore we had a capacity to be able to internalize the Torah itself at the most advanced level. The wellspring of Miriam was only in the merit of the water you offered. The tree was, the shade was, we merited the clouds of glory. So all these miracles that we experienced, we were in this spiritual cocoon for 40 years, was due to Avram being pained that the desecration of God's name is continuous if he doesn't engage with these wayfarers. Otherwise, they would have come as what? As angels, not as human beings. Therefore, Avram Avinu is considered the pillar of loving kindness. Pesach, that festival corresponds to Avram Avinu. That's Avram Avinu. Yaakov is Sukkot. The festival is the closing festival of the year. That's the third festival. Now, what's the festival of Sukkot? Because it says Avram built Sukkot. Yaakov built Sukkot because he spent 2 summers and a winter on the way back. 18 months he traveled back from Mesopotamia back to Canaan. Of all the patriarchs, the most spiritual of the patriarchs, the most perfect was Yaakov. Yaakov, in the words of Chazal, is identified as Mufcha Sheba'avos. He was the most chosen of the patriarchs. We see Avram fathered Yitzchak, but he fathered Yishmael. Yishmael was an expression of the impurity that existed within him. Yitzchak fathered Yaakov and Esav. Esav was an expression of the impurity that existed within Yaakov, although Esav had free choice. Yaakov, all his children, are referred to as the tribes of God. Each one was the patriarch of his particular line. And the Jewish people are comprised of the 12 tribes. Yaakov was that special patriarch. We had mentioned, the Ramban writes, when Yaakov was traveling to the home of his future father-in-law, Lavan, his uncle, it says he stopped off at Mount Moriah and he had a prophetic vision. He saw angels ascending and descending a ladder. That was the prophetic vision he saw. And it says, and God stood on top of the ladder. So Ramban writes, what is the significance of God standing on top of the ladder? This is what he envisioned in his prophetic vision. That he says, normally we say, there's a verse in Psalms, God has angels which protect us. Yaakov, when it's such a special level, Yaakov needed no angels. God says, because of your level of attachment to me, you have nothing to worry about. Yaakov is so attached to God. As we see later, Yaakov initially was given the name Yaakov by his parents. After he had engaged with the angel, what did the angel say? Your name will no longer be Yaakov, it will be Yisrael. In addition to Yaakov, Yisrael. Why? Because you lorded over God and man, and you succeeded, and you were victorious. Yaakov was able to not only dominate the physical world, he was able to dominate the spiritual world. He had the upper hand. God, from that time going forward, he was guaranteed that level of protection. God says, you're no longer in need of angels to protect you. V'yamod Hashem Olav, God stood upon him. He became what we call the location for the divine presence at that moment. Therefore, he needed no protection of angels. Of course, when you're so attached to God, you need no protection whatsoever. That's the understanding. So the holiday of Sukkot corresponds to Yaakov. We'll discuss in a moment. Now, God says to Avraham Avinu, after he hosts the angels, he says, in the merit of the shade of your tree, your children, the future will merit the clouds of glory. In the merit of the water he provided for the angels to wash their feet, you're going to merit, your children will merit the wellspring of Miriam. And the merit of the bread that you offered, your children will merit the manna. So Avraham Avinu asks Hashem, whenever we do a mitzvah, the effect of a mitzvah is unending. So he says, and after 40 years, when we will no longer have the clouds of glory, when we're going to enter into the promised land, what will be a continuation of the effect of me offering the shade of my tree? This is a question Avraham asked God. So Hashem says to Avraham, Yeshli mitzvah, I have a mitzvah, the Sukkah Shema. I have a mitzvah, it's called Sukkah. The Sukkah will take the place of the clouds of glory. That will be a continuum of the effect of you offering your shade to the angels. That will be a continuum of the clouds of glory. Okay? The Gemara tells us in Sukkah, there's an argument between Rebbe Lezer and Rebbe Akiva when the Torah says that we must sit in the Sukkah for 7 days during the month of Tishrei, which we begin tonight. That all your generations should know that the Jews, during that 40-year period, they dwelt in Sukkos. So there's an argument. The Sukkos mean huts, like we refer to a sukkah as a hut. Of course, it has to meet certain criteria to be qualified for the mitzvah. Or the Sukkos mean the clouds of glory. Rebbe Lezer says, when God says to commemorate what happened in the desert, we sit in the Sukkah to commemorate the clouds of glory. That's Rebbe Lezer. Rebbe Akiva says, no. When it says to commemorate the Sukkos, it means huts. That for 40 years, we dwelt in huts for 40 years. So it's slightly difficult. According to Rebbe Lezer, what are we commemorating? We're commemorating the miracle of the clouds of glory. Except, how do we commemorate it? By sitting in these booths, meet certain criteria, which is the equivalent to commemorate the clouds of glory. Because it's a miracle, as we just said. Protected them from the elements. It leveled all the mountains. There was no incline. There was no decline, everything. It cleansed the garments didn't wear out, miraculous. But according to Rebbe Akiva, to commemorate, they lived in booths. And if you lived in a high-rise, you can make a mitzvah to commemorate you live in a high-rise apartment. So what exactly is it? The answer is, do you think those booths, you're able to survive the elements? It's impossible. The heat, the cold, the dust, the sand, the scorpions, the snakes, whatever. How do you survive it? In those booths were chambers that miracles took place within the booths, but it's the booths. They weren't ordinary booths. They weren't ordinary huts. That's Rebbe Akiva. Rebbe Lezer says, no, it's purely to commemorate the clouds of glory. That's what it is. It's not the booth, which is an ordinary booth, and despite that, we survived it. That will be similar. We find that Moshe Rabbeinu, he's born prematurely. After 3 months, Yocheved, his mother, had no choice. She fashioned a box and she put him into the Nile. And the box floated, and it was discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. And he became the adopted prince of Egypt. Now, that little box, which was made of a certain type of wood, did that box save Moshe Rabbeinu? Moshe Rabbeinu should have drowned. It was a miracle he did not drown. So we explained then, there's an argument in the Midrash, the wood that Yocheved purchased to fashion that box, to put Moshe in that box to put him to the Nile, was it the best quality wood, or it was the most inferior quality wood? So one opinion is it was the most inferior quality wood. Why? Because tzaddikim chavim mamonim yosem migufa. A tzaddik, when he spends money, he values every cent, and he's not going to be wasteful. Yocheved did not want to be wasteful, so therefore she purchased the most inferior quality wood. You ever hear such a thing? It's her special child. It's a question of life and death, and she buys the most inferior quality wood because she doesn't want to be wasteful to spend more than she has to. You turn worlds for this. So we explained Moshe Rabbeinu was the Redeemer of Israel. If she would have put Moshe into the water directly, Moshe wouldn't have drowned. Moshe would have survived. What was the value of fashioning this box? It was only to conceal the miracle. That was the purpose of it. Because we find when the 10 plagues started, and Hashem says to Moshe, strike the Nile. Who struck the Nile? Not Moshe. The one who struck the Nile was Aaron, his brother. Why? Because if Moshe striking the Nile would have been an act of an ingrate. Here the Nile saved you because you should have drowned and you didn't drown. So therefore Aaron was one to strike the Nile, not Moshe. So what was the value of the box? Only to conceal the miracle. Because God doesn't perform miracles where it's undeniable, it's a miracle, because this actually undermines one's free choice. So therefore, if you want to attribute Moshe's survival, it's a tribute to the box, which his mother fashioned. But in reality, it was a miracle. Therefore, and Yocheved understanding that, spending more than is necessary to conceal the miracle is unnecessary. That's considered wasteful. We dwelt in booths, a regular booth. You can pick up that booth at Home Depot. But you understand, if you're in the Sudan or the Sahara, you're not surviving in that booth. So how did you survive? Miracle. So what was the value of the booth? That's to conceal the miracle. Same idea. That's Rabbi Akiva. Rebbe Lezer says, no. When it says the Jews were in booths in the desert, the word booth it's not referring to the huts. It's referring specifically to the Anei HaKavod, to the clouds of glory. Okay? Now, the Midrash I mentioned, the conversation between Avram and God says, because you offered the shade of your tree, your children, your descendants, when they will be in the desert, they'll be provided with clouds of glory to protect them. So Avram says to God, and what's after 40 years? The miracle, the value should continue. He says, I have a mitzvah, which will be a continuum of that. It's called Sukkah. The Vilna Gaon cites this midrash in his introduction to the laws of Sukkah. Without this midrash, I would say, we commemorate things. What's commemoration? It's purely a commemorative. We do this so we should remember something of the past. According to what we're saying now, the mitzvah of Sukkah is the equivalent of the clouds of glory. It's a continuum. Whatever the innate value of the clouds of glory were, which was to provide protection for the Jewish people on many levels, when we sit in the Sukkah for 7 days during the holiday, the festival of Sukkot, the value of that mitzvah, whatever protection we merit throughout the year, it's due to sitting in that Sukkah for 7 days. As the clouds of glory provided that protection continuously, when we're in the clouds of glory, God says, when you sit in that Sukkah for 7 days, it will have the same value as the clouds of glory. You will merit that level of protection, spiritual protection. So it's not just commemorative, but it's the reality of the clouds of glory. But where do we see this? We find the Torah uses a term, juxtaposes the Sukkah it refers to it as Chag. Sukkah is the only festival which is referred to as Chag. Chag, what does the word Chag mean? Celebration, Chagiga. But there was a festival offering that was brought on every one of the festivals. Every male Jew had an obligation to bring a festival offering to celebrate the holiday. The word, it's referred to as Chag, meaning the Torah is saying that just as when you consecrate that animal for the festival offering, it has innate holiness, the sukkah itself, when you build it and designate it for the mitzvah, the wood and the schach assume a holiness. It has a consecrated status for 7 days. As the animal, when you consecrate it, it has a holy status due to the consecration. The sukkah, the booth that you build for the mitzvah of sukkah, assumes that same level of holiness as what? As the festival offering. So what is that? If it's purely commemorative, why should it assume any level of holiness? But if we say it's a continuum of the clouds of glory, what were the clouds of glory? We were entombed in the Shekhinah, in God's presence. God's divine presence is holy. The clouds of glory was an expression of God's presence. So the sukkah, which is a continuum of that, what is that? It has innate holiness. It's the equivalent of the clouds of glory. Therefore, the holiness, the innate value of the sukkah has the same status as the festival offering for that reason. So it's another. So we say, that your generations should know that the Jews were in the clouds of glory then. So when we sit in the sukkah, we're actually sitting in something which is the equivalent of the clouds of glory. And that's what has the innate holiness. Cites the Zohar that the sukkah, the booth without the schach, the roof covering made of a certain material, is not considered a sukkah. It must be made of a certain type of material, whether it's bamboo, whether it's other vegetation. It cannot be a fruit. Anything which is susceptible to contamination doesn't qualify to be the roof covering of a sukkah. The schach on the sukkah comes from the word schach. Socha means it covers. It's a covering. The Anei HaKavod, the clouds covered us. We were enclosed and protected. Was a covering. The Zohar refers to the schach of the sukkah as silta d'shchinte. You're sitting in the shade of God. You're in God's shade. When you sit in the sukkah, you're sitting in God's presence. That's the Zohar. Without this midrash, which the Vilna Gaon cites in the introduction to the laws of Sukkah, the question is why? Why is it? Why are you sitting in God's presence? We're always in God's presence. Why in the Sukkah it isn't God's presence? You walk out of the Sukkah, you're not in God's presence. You're not sitting in the shade of His divine presence. As we're explaining it, what is the Sukkah with the schach? It's a continuum of the clouds of glory. What were the clouds of glory? It was God's presence. That's what protected us. The sukkah itself is God's presence. So if it's it's the Shekhinah, it's the divine presence. And that's why it provides that protection, as the clouds of glory did. Therefore, it's called Silta Dishchinte. It's the shade of the Shekhinah, of the divine presence. As a result of the Chofetz Chaim says, there's certain laws which pertain to the sukkah. For instance, that after you finish eating, you should remove the unclean dishes. And if you serve out of a pot, you don't leave the pot in the sukkah. You take it out. It's not appropriate. Not appropriate. Even though the Torah says you must go from a permanent residence into a temporary residence for 7 days, right? That's the mitzvah. We sit in this temporary residence for 7 days. So if my home, I'm permitted to leave the pot on the table and to bust the table whenever I choose to bust the table of unclean dishes. But yet in the sukkah, You just can't leave unclean dishes on the table. After you finish eating, they should be removed immediately. The pot should be taken out immediately once the food is served. If a person wants to have a urinal in the sukkah, it's not appropriate. Not appropriate. It's outside the sukkah. But why? It's my residence. The answer is, as we're saying now, what is the sukkah? The sukkah itself is what is the equivalent of the clouds of glory. You not only you're in God's presence, you're in the presence of the divine presence. It's inappropriate to leave unclean dishes, the pots after the food has been served. You remove it. To urinate in the sukkah, it's not appropriate. The Jews in the desert, whenever they had to do their bodily functions, they went outside of the clouds of glory. That's where they did it. That was the value of the manna. The food was absorbed in their inner organs. There was no excretions for the body. There was no defecation. That was a convenience. But that's what it is. Now it's interesting. Torah says you must sit in the sukkah for 7 days. What happens on the 8th day? The 8th day, there's another festival. It's called Shmini Atzeres. It's the 8th day. Shmini Atzeres, and the Talmud tells us Shmini Atzeres is an adjunct to Sukkot, but yet it has its independent identity. For instance, if one did not bring a festival offering during the 7 days of Sukkot, you still could bring it on the 8th day. Why? Because the 8th day is an adjunct to the 7 days of Sukkot. But for instance, does one have an obligation to sit in the sukkah? On Shmini Atzeres, the answer is no. Does one have an obligation to take the 4 species? No, it's only 7 days. So here, Sukkot has its own identity, which is sukkah and the 4 species. But the moment the 8th day comes, it's an adjunct in terms of your festival offering. You still bring the festival offering. In terms of water libations, throughout the year, the only libations poured on the altar were wine libations. Sukkot, Shmini Atzeres, in addition to wine libations on the altar, there were water libations. So it's a continuum of Sukkot. But in regard to the 4 species and the sukkah, one no longer sits in the sukkah. Now, first of all, why is the Shmini Atzeres? Why do we have an adjunct of the 8th day? Pesach has 7 days. After the 7 days over, the holiday's over. But yet, Sukkot, we have Shmini Atzeres. We have this extension which identifies to a degree with Sukkot, but it's different. One doesn't need the sukkah and one does not need the 4 species. What's the reason? We said many times, name it a Maral of Prague, in terms of the significance of numbers. What is the significance of the number 7? What does 7 connote? 7, anything within the natural order is connoted by 7. Why? Because the process of creation was a 7-day process. 7 days of creation. So everything in the physical realm identifies with the number 7. We speak of the 70 root nations. The 70 root nations. I mentioned the Jewish people of the 71st nation. We transcend the natural order. A human being is born with a foreskin, a male. God says on the 8th day of the child's life, you must remove that foreskin. Must be removed. 8, but you say, if naturally you're supposed to have the foreskin, so why are you removing it? The answer is because the Jewish people are not subject to what pertains to the natural order. We supersede, we transcend that natural. Therefore, the Torah says you remove it. We find Shavuos is the day we became God's chosen people. They are given in the Torah. How many days after Pesach is Shavuos? 50 days. The 50th day. What's 50? 50 is the day which precedes 7 multiples of 7. That's 8. 50 is the equivalent of 8. When we became God's chosen people, we transcended everything within the physical realm. Our innate value takes on another value from now on. The laws of the Torah are not subject to, even though we live as physical beings, and it is actualized in the physical. You eat matzah, you sit in the sukkah, you take the 4 species, but the innate value of that is spiritual. They're only doing actions which are symbolisms of something in the spiritual realm. That's what it is. That's 8. Why does God say to us, this holiday, you have an 8th day? So the Midrash says something very interesting. Hashem says the father loves his child, and the child comes to stay for a few days. Now the child's about to depart from the father. So the father says to the child, because my love for you is so overwhelming, our parting is so difficult. I'm pained when you part from me. Why don't you stay another day? Should stay another day. And because of that's an expression of God's love, therefore we have the 8th day, which extends beyond the 7 days of Sukkot. When we separate, now, the Sukkah itself, we said, is the clouds of glory. When the clouds of glory protected us, why do we need clouds of glory? Because we are who we are. Physical beings, we need the clouds of glory to protect us. The Sukkah, as we said, is a continuum of the clouds of glory, like the Jews in the desert. When you cleave to God himself, it's not just an expression of God. The clouds of glory were an extension of God. He provided it. Shmini Atzeres, God says, I want to be intimate with you. The departure is too difficult. Stay another day. When you're attached to God at that level, you need no protection. It's like Yaakov on the Mount Moriah, where God stood on top of that ladder. God says, from now on, you need no angels to protect you. You have to be special, then angels should protect you. But you go beyond special. You don't need the angel. Because where you are, that's where my presence is. When you're to that degree attached, you need no protection. As a result of that, we don't need the symbolism of the Sukkah any longer. The Sukkah itself is the clouds of glory. Shmini Atzeres is beyond the clouds of glory. When you're that enmeshed with God, you need no protection from anything. You're living in a spiritual realm. Therefore, on the 8th day, it's a continuum. In Ralad, you bring the festival offering. Because the day innately has that holiness. But in terms of falling short of the ultimate, that you should need protection, you need no protection. Therefore, we don't need a sukkah. The whole idea of which we need to discuss, the 4 species, which each one's a representation of a segment of the Jewish people. The Jewish people, the segment which are Torah sages, scholars, and those who observe mitzvahs. Those who study Torah but not are meticulous in the observance of mitzvahs. Those who observe mitzvahs but don't have Torah knowledge. And those who are totally devoid of spirituality. I just want to finish up the idea which we're discussing. Now we understand why Yaakov corresponds to the Sukkah. The Sukkah itself is the divine presence. That's what the Sukkah is. Yaakov Avinu represented the divine presence. As I said, from Mount Moriah, God says, I am associated with you. That's the clouds of glory. Shmini Atzeres was climaxing that. You don't even need the Sukkah because of that. And that's what God says to Yaakov when he left Mount Moriah. I will watch over you. I will bring you back intact, physically and spiritually. And that's what it says, Vayovo Yaakov Shalem. When he returned after being away for 36 years, it says he came back Shalem. He came back home. Rashi cites the Midrash, Shalem b'Toroso, v'Shalem b'Gufo. He was whole in his physicality, and he was whole in his Torah. Spirituality was not diminished as much as an iota, although he was in an environment which was the antithesis of what holiness was, which what Lovin represented, what that whole community represented. God protected him at that ultimate level. Because when you're that attached to God, everything is totally blotted out and negated, and all that exists is yourself. And that's why Yaakov was able to raise such a special family. And could you imagine being in a spiritual cesspool and raising children which are living angels. How do you do it? The answer is with Yaakov was, he was insulated because God is with Yaakov. And when you're in the presence of God at that level, it negates everything around it. The ill effects and the influences from the outside have no relevance to you. Therefore, Yaakov, despite the environment had no relevance to him. Therefore, he was able to raise those special children, which are identified by David as the Shiftei Kah, which comprise the Jewish people for that reason. Just as a little bit more, we find that the portion of Vayechi is referred to as a sealed portion. Why is it Parshas Stuma? Because when Yaakov passed away, on a certain subliminal level, Egypt, the environment started to affect the Jews negatively. As long as Yaakov existed, there was no negative effect. Why? But it's that environment. They represent everything debased and perverted, and spiritually, it's an abyss of spirituality. How? The answer is because who's Yaakov? Where Yaakov is, that's where the divine presence is. So his family being associated with him, it's as if Egypt doesn't exist. The moment Yaakov passes away, the divine presence is no longer there. Now you're subject to the environment, special as you are, you're subject to environments. Now the spiritual erosion begins at that particular moment. Second.